Right, the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance. We've been talking quite a bit about this week the progressive era and how it impacted African Americans and really spawns a new African American civil rights movement. But it also spawns a migration, and we're going to talk about that, and then its impacts in the city of Harlem in New York and this growth of art and culture in the African American um, society. All right, so what is the Great Migration? It begins in the early 1900s and it involves a mass exodus of millions of African Americans from the South to the North. Over 1 million are estimated to have migrated north, and it greatly influences the Harlem Renaissance. Part of what happens is in 1900, 90% of blacks lived in southern states. But by 1910, you have a population boom in the north, and that is because people are moving. As industrial jobs are opening up, a demand for new workers, and you have African Americans in the South who are living under strict Jim Crow laws, they're seeing the North as a place where they can go and seek economic opportunity and sort of financial independence. So why would they migrate? One, freedom, more equal treatment. There was also a boll weevil crop infestation of the cotton crops. There were new technological innovations, and actually World War I, by the time we get to 1918, opens up a lot of industrial jobs to African Americans. You also have, those are pull factors. You have push factors like racial backlash by whites, Jim Crow, and people trying to prove their identity. So why go north? Better life in general. Push factors: Jim Crow in the South, racial violence. There were 2,500 lynchings in America between the 1890s and the 1920s. So there was a real fear for your life in some cases. Limited economic opportunities in the South. You really were just limited to sharecropping. And there was an increased demand in the North, which are pull factors for industrial workers. There were better educational opportunities, schools, etc., and increased political opportunities in the North. Between 1889 and 1918, a total of 2,500 people were lynched. 50 of them were women. These people were hanged, burned alive, or hacked to death by the KKK in a lot of cases, usually wrongfully accused of some sort of crime or violation. And that became a real public policy crisis for the United States. So when you go north, here are the advantages and the disadvantages. People thought they were getting freedom, identity, and larger communities, which they did, but racism existed in the North just like in the South. Schools were still segregated, neighborhoods were segregated, and there was a false perception of opportunity that really might not have existed. So here you can see the waves of migration. You had big waves going up into the Northeast, into large cities in the North, as well as a later wave that makes its way into California. You have a second wave from 1930 to 1970, but the big chunk, earliest chunk, was 1910 to 1930. 6 million African Americans move out of the South and into the Northeast, Midwest, and West, into large cities like New York, Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, Pittsburgh. It is the largest internal movement in American history. And by the end, most African Americans became urbanized rather than being rural. And northern cities became significantly more black. So here you can see the population shifts. And again, more shifts here. Washington, D.C., 31% in 1900 as a percentage of their population were African Americans. And by 1990, 65% of their population. On the contrary, Jacksonville ended the century in around 25% of their population being black when they started with a 57% black population. So even southern, you can see the southern cities losing. Chicago in 1900 had 1.8% of its total population were African American, and by 1990, 39%. So how was the North affected? Greater population. They were initially not welcome. You saw some white flight, whites fleeing to newly created suburbs, and some boost in the economy. In New York, you have a sort of what becomes known as the Harlem Renaissance, which is an arts and African American arts and cultural movement that starts with music, art, food, civil rights, gets its growth and power to the people in this time. It was a culturalistic and nationalistic movement sparked by the Great Migration, and it was originally called the New Negro Movement. It was kind of a coming in age and a chance for African Americans to really express themselves. Black migration south to north changed their image from rural to urban, and it becomes a way for people to sort of break free of stereotypes and really create their own identity. Some of the major contributors to this Harlem Renaissance were Langston Hughes, who wrote a lot of poetry, novels, and short stories. W.E.B. Du Bois was involved as a public speaker and a socialist and one of the first leaders of the civil rights movement. You had musicians like Louis Armstrong and Billie Holiday who introduced even white communities to jazz music and blues music. And you had women writing novels and poetry. So it really does spawn sort of a new interest in African American life and culture and creates a unique African American identity in this time period. The end.